Selection prep versus cube course prep versus team prep. As you have made clear, selection prep involves mainly endurance, running, and rucking with a strength component. How does this style of training differ from what will be needed to excel during the Q course, as well as once you get to a team? That's a really cool question. I'll let you start with that one.
Yeah, the biggest differences I like to talk about is selection. While it's not necessarily a sprint, still 3 weeks long, is much more of a sprint than the Q course. So it's going to be much more performance focused. We're going to be trying to get those run times really competitive. We still want to have a big emphasis on durability and things like that, but we can kind of go into like what you said, the like a peak phase, right? Like that peak performance in it. Once you get past that environment and you're in the Q course and eventually on a team, the biggest thing I like to tell guys is there's no more off season. You don't get to finish selection. And like in my case where I was in the 160th, I had a year between selection and Q course. Like that's never going to happen again. So the focus becomes much more on durability. That means maybe if you got a really high mileage per week going into selection, maybe we reduce that down a little bit. Maybe we hit a lot more accessory work, focus on imbalances, focus on any aches and pains that we might have. A lot of guys have, including myself, this is kind of what caused my back issue when I was on a team, is an imbalance in their hips, right? So hip strength, posterior strength, resiliency with the impact of rucking over long distances and periods of time are going to be the biggest components and the biggest difference in regards to training for selection versus training for the Q course and being on a team. The specific split doesn't need to change drastically. Like if you still want to it depends on the guy, right? If it's someone that wants to improve on their run or wants to improve on their strength, then obviously the split would look a little bit different. But assuming somebody has pretty balanced performance overall, you don't need to go create a much different split than you did for selection as opposed to the Q course. Just the volume, the intensity, and the time you take to recover would go down a little bit, right? So what I like to do in pretty traditional, like Eastern European kind of strength work is that those 3 weeks of work and then followed by that 4th deload week. A lot of times, like it's from a fatigue standpoint, it might be too soon for some guys, right? Especially if you're a younger guy that has a high level of recoverability. You might not necessarily require that 4th deload week. You might be able to push it out to 6 or 8 weeks, but that's going to depend highly on your energy levels in an environment where you can't necessarily control that. I do like to program in those deload weeks a little bit more frequently to allow that recovery to take place. And taking those and being disciplined with it over a long period of time is really going to limit those injuries. Because if you continue to push it out too far and continue to try to do too much, you might be getting a couple extra reps, a couple extra training sessions in, but at what cost? And are you putting yourself in a position to where you get an injury and then you are, not able to help your team as much, or maybe you get hurt completely and your team goes on a deployment or goes on mission without you, right? So the focus is much, much more on durability, not just like peak performance because you're being assessed.
Yeah, totally agree with that. The way I look at selection is, even though it's 3 weeks, like Jon said, you are still training as if it's an event rather than training for the different events and daily things and weekly things that occur when you're in the Q course or when you're on a team. So even though it's not like you're training for an ultra marathon that's going to be one day, or maybe it's a long one in like 2 days, it still involves a general physical preparedness / base building phase when you're further out. Then when you get close, you want to make things more specific. And for selection, the specificity component is going to be highly focused on rucking, both ruck speed as well as, even more importantly, ruck endurance, just the ability to do it day after day after day at a relatively slow, yet it's still demanding just because of the duration of it, because of the ruck weight pace. And also, you'll kind of ramp that intensity up, you'll ramp that volume up as you get close to selection, also known as peaking. And then you will, hopefully, if you're doing it right, taper a little bit, allow that fatigue to go away, allow those fitness levels to stay really high. The fatigue, if you finish your peaking phase for selection and you're actually doing things right, your fatigue and your fitness levels are going to be pretty similar. This is what gets a lot of people messed up, is they won't make weekly improvements as they're peaking. If you're peaking properly, you're not going to make improvements every single time, because it's like a neck and neck race of like fatigue and fitness levels. But when you finish your peak and you dial things back for the last, 10 days, 14 days, 7 days, whatever, there's a lot of different ways to taper. That fatigue goes away way faster than fitness will. And you're also not just taking time out. Like tapering, if you do it right, there's an art to it, but you're not just stopping all fitness. But even if you were, fitness gains don't go away that fast. The only thing that really goes away super fast is power, which is one of the least important aspects of being prepped for selection. So you're doing a little bit of training just to keep like your calisthenics up. You're doing some runs, maybe some pickups, maybe some strides, just to continue being used to running faster. But that fatigue just goes way, way down. And you show up to selection super duper fit, hopefully low fatigue, not banged up, mentally ready, because being super fatigued from your training also kind of bleeds into the mentality as well. And also you're just going to be mentally stressed because you're about to go to selection. So it's like you're training for an event with a lot of specific fitness disciplines rather than in the Q course, you are going to be fluctuating. Your fitness is going to fluctuate a lot in the Q course because you're going to go out to Camp McCall for 6 weeks, 8 weeks or whatever. And yeah, you're not going to be like deloading and resting, but you're just going to be rucking a lot. You're not going to be sleeping great. You're not going to have the best nutrition. So your fitness levels are going to go down during that period of time. You're going to go out to SEER. SEER's not a deload either. You're going several days without food towards the end. So you're going to come back and you're going to be a little bit less fit. The big thing that I like to recommend, John kind of hit on all the things I wanted to touch on for the actual fitness maintenance aspect of it. But a big mistake a lot of people make, actually, we are going to hit on one more thing during language. But a big mistake people make throughout the Q course is they will come back from a field event or they'll come back from a place where they are not able to train the way they're normally training, and they'll be a little depleted. For example, SEER school or SUT, you're in a stressed out state, even though you haven't been training a ton. And they will they'll be like, oh man, I got a lot of ground to make up. So I'm going to crank up the volume and the intensity right away to make up for all this time that I didn't train. And that is not a good idea. You want to ease back into it. I didn't do this. I'm not saying that I did this, but I highly suggest doing that because you're better off underestimating and like really dialing things back and easing back into it, even for 5 days, 6 days, a week, 2 weeks, than you are having that mindset of like, I need to make up for this, or I'm a piece of shit. I just didn't train for 8 weeks when you didn't even have an option to. But people will play some weird games with themselves and have some weird self-talk, like somehow blame themselves for going out to SUT and passing SUT and not training. And they'll try and make up for it. They'll launch back into it. And that is usually best case scenario. You are going to be super sore, super fatigued, super banged up. You're going to detract from your ability to regain the fitness that you want to regain. Worst case scenario, you're going to hurt yourself. You're going to get rolled back part of the Q course or something along those lines. So definitely ease back into things. Also, language. Language is the part of the Q course the only part of the Q course, give or take, where you can put a solid half a year straight of consistent training in. So you're going to class from, I want to say when we went, it was like 8 to 3 or 8 to 4, something along those lines. When I was there was very little required PT, especially if you got a good enough score on what I would assume they probably do the ACFT now. If you get a whatever score in the ACFT, every time you guys take it, then you get to do PT on your own. And if you don't, then you might have to do some more structured PT. But 2 huge mistakes that a lot of people make in language. One, they don't take advantage of the extra time and they don't do any extra training themselves. And they show up to group really fat, unfit, not ready to actually go and perform with the team. Or they do train, but they go to Steers in Fayetteville and they get their favorite SARM or pro hormone or whatever it may be. You have no idea what that shit is. It could be any different thing that probably isn't actually what they're saying it is. And they go on it and it results in a shit ton of muscle gain. Blood pressure goes way up, get super jacked. Liver markers, lipid markers just go all out of whack. So you're basically putting a foreign substance, you have no idea what it is, into your body in order to get super jacked, because a lot of people will think, oh, I need to be a Green Beret. That means I have to look super jacked. And they end up getting really jacked. And this happened to multiple people in my class. And they failed the 2-mile run and they got rolled back into the next class just because they wanted to get super jacked and super strong, and it completely destroyed their conditioning. So those are the two main mistakes not to make in the queue. And you don't have to be a freak of nature. Like I said earlier, you want to show up as fit as you can be, but you don't have to look like Captain America. You don't have to be you don't have to be deadlifting 600 pounds. You don't have to be squatting 500 pounds. Just very balanced. Like John said, a few days a week lifting. You can do the deload thing. Oftentimes, he mentioned the deloads. Oftentimes the Q course just throws deloads at you because you're, training for a few weeks and then you go out to a detail or whatever it may be. Not necessarily a deload, like you're not getting recovery from that, but you can definitely auto-regulate a little bit. If you normally take a deload every 4 weeks, but next week you're going out to the field for 5 days, like you can train that week, and you could overreach a little bit going into that, just knowing that you're not going to train for 7 days. That takes a little skill. It takes a little bit of humility and not being dumb with it, but that's kind of the way I did it. And then you take 5-7 days off because you have to, and then you come back and then again ease back into it. So yeah, really cool question. Definitely something I might actually make a full podcast episode on that in the future. But yeah, I think we covered pretty much everything.